Right. Like I could still like wear pants and talk to James Joyce. You know what I mean? Like there's that much proximity.
What is the most memorable conversation that you've had about James Joyce?
I guess that's an interesting question because like I don't have a single memory that comes to mind, but I would say that like when I think of James Joyce now, I definitely think about you and your like research and this project for sure because something like I've experienced with Joyce's work, and especially because I think of like the reputation Ulysses has or like Finnegan's Wake has, is that like
Mhm.
people don't want to talk about something they don't know about, or like I felt like Joyce was always kind of like, if he was on a syllabus, he was kind of like snuck in there, like a story from Dubliners rather than like a novel or portrait or something. So it's like, I feel like I'm actually like prevented from having a memorable experience with Joyce because
Okay.
like I didn't feel like I got exposed to Joyce at all in like high school, definitely not, but not even really in undergrad.
Okay, that's it. What about like so you sort of mentioned because of like Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake like reputation, that might be part of the reason why we like don't talk about his works more at length. What is your like especially because I know like we're reading Ulysses together, but like especially
Mhm.
before you started reading Ulysses, like what was that conception of his longer works?
I don't know, like I think my only points of reference were like other people from the period. So I was thinking about like writers like Woolf or Eliot and kind of expecting Joyce to be like a larger version of like an Eliot poem or like a larger, like maybe more male version of like a Virginia Woolf novel. And like just from the first page, you're like, oh, this is not that. Um like you can see how these kind of works were like maybe in conversation with one another, but I don't even think like stylistically they're that similar. So I totally like had my mind changed from like first sentence, first page on.
Wow. Okay, that's very interesting. And so is like Ulysses the first, like apart from like a couple Dubliner stories here and there, is this like your first time reading Joyce?
Yeah, so
Okay.
I remember, and there might have been other stories from Dubliners, but I can only recall reading The Dead in an introduction to British literature course in my second year at U of T. And so this is my first like sustained Joyce reading, I guess.
Okay. Are there any of his texts, I guess, like after, like now that you've kind of more in the midst of Ulysses, are there any of his texts that you like are planning to read in the future or definitely know you'll never read?
I think well, like you, for example, had mentioned that like a lot of the ideas that are explored in Ulysses were like, or like Joyce had experimented with them in portrait and maybe like in a more condensed format. And so I think that that could also be an interesting experience, especially reading maybe Ulysses first and then portrait second, which I think maybe is the opposite order that people usually do. So that could be interesting.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like that'll be a very different. I don't know. Most people with Joy seem to go just like publication order, but I don't know
Mhm.
that. Like I read it that way, and it gave me this very like linear perspective of him of like, oh, his work just gets like more abstract as you go, but really it's doing the same thing, but he's just like writing in a different way.
Right.
But I don't know. I think you're in like a really exciting position to like not be forced into that
Mhm.
assumption about what his work is doing.
I think also it's like interesting that you bring up reading chronologically. Like
Mm-hmm.
maybe people read chronologically with like the assumption that things become more like difficult or complex. I don't know if we like really read many other authors that way. That seems like particular to an author like Joyce, for example. Because I don't know if you picked up like Virginia Woolf, no one's going to tell you like, no, this is the order you have to do it. Like that's an interesting, like the fact that there's like a tradition around how you're supposed to read it or like the order you're supposed to read it is interesting. And I know that like you're very interested in religion as well. And like it's almost like how you would read like the books of the Bible or something where like you're building on or like
That's so
becoming more complex.
No, that's so interesting. Actually, it's wild that you say that right now because I'm actually exposing my like Bible nerdiness, but I'm listening to the like Bible in a Year podcast where actually it like I don't
Okay.
know, it like pair like you follow along the like narrative books, but it like pairs them with like the more like abstract or like law book sort of things that it goes with them. So it's like reading the Bible in this like, it's like a very thought out, but it's not like in chronological order.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of makes me wish that I'd done that with Joyce, because it's like
Yeah.
immediately making so many more connections. People are just like admitting stuff to me in these interviews that I think is like a very much a Joyce thing, where it's just like this random stranger who lives across the world and I've never met. And they'll be like, oh, like I was like raised Catholic and like this is why I fell out of it. And I'm like blah, blah, blah now. And I'm like, you didn't have to tell me that. But like something about
Right.
the conversation being about Joyce just seems to like open that too.
Honestly, like I think often when we feel like frightened by like an intellectual discussion, or like we feel like maybe it's hard to tackle a book like Ulysses like intellectually, we kind of like revert to like a more like affective or like emotional reading of the book. But I don't actually, I think that, or like discussion of the book, but I think that that can be just as valuable. Like, so it's interesting that like that shift takes place when we talk about Ulysses, for example, but like it seems like it's yielding really fruitful conversations. So that's great.
The breadth of Joyce, where I don't know if you've read the Cyclops episode yet with like the citizen and all of his like anti-Semitism, but like I've really been talking to people about how like there's room in the text to read that from any perspective, where I
Right.
think like I'm obviously like this character sucks and he's gross, but then like Joyce somehow writes in this way where like like if you were someone who's like that character, you wouldn't be like attacked by the way he's presenting it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess like I'm not at that point in the novel yet, but we've like had conversations during the reading group about like Jewishness and Joyce.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's, I mean, from where I'm at in the book, it's just interesting because I think it complicates our understanding of like Ireland or Irish politics as being like purely like a Protestant versus Catholic struggle, or like it
Mm-hmm.
adds another like layer that I think is interesting. Um, and like we've had conversations about whether the like anti-Semitism, I don't think it's reflective of Joyce's opinions, but we've had conversations about like the role it plays in the book and how it like reoccurs. So I'm like interested in following that thread throughout the novel as well.
I find it interesting that you brought up sort of like this, I don't know if it's a need, but like I think sort of a push to like contextualize Joyce and think about like Irish politics at the time, and how
Mhm.
that, and I feel like especially in balance with what you said about how it's sort of like more comfortable, or our first like, I don't know, like instinct almost to like just read
Mhm.
it like
Mhm.
from like a personal perspective. Have you found reading it that you like, I don't know, that it almost like points you towards these like larger aspects of like wanting to look at annotations or like wanting to like research the history?
It's so weird because like the novel is so like granular, like there's so many details that you could cling to that I do think it's like such a personal experience to be like, this is the detail or this is the theme I'm choosing to like follow, because there's so much to choose from.
Mm-hmm.
um but I think like historical thinking is like one way that we try to make sense of a novel when it's like challenging. So
Okay.
I mean, I guess it's one way of like trying to understand like the big picture way of reading Ulysses. But like I've also really enjoyed conversations where we've been like, the use of this word is so strange, or this detail is so bizarre. Like let's talk about that. So I think it lends itself to like really close reading, but then also we can be like, we can take a detail and like project it and make like wild assumptions about it. So that's kind of a, it's fun like zoom in and zoom out when we read Ulysses, I think.
What is Ulysses then? If it's sort of, I don't know, because I think like as like people who study literature, we're aware that like a lot of literature can do this, where you like do that like zoom in to a specific detail, but then you use that to kind of like contextualize the whole, and then you use the whole to contextualize the detail, and you kind of go back and forth. But like it
Mm-hmm.
just seems to me, like from my own experience and also talking to people, that it's sort of like really heightened in Ulysses. Like we just like recognize it more. So like if someone asks you to like what do you have like a any thoughts about like what Ulysses is or what it's doing that makes it that sort of like, you know, almost like a meta commentary on itself?
Um, I guess I don't know about meta commentary, but like cultural impact. It's big in literary studies, but then also like it's a brick that you can carry around with yourself, and like you can see it from the other side of the room, and you're like, that's Ulysses. It's a big book, and there's a lot of ideas in there. And like one day, if I sit down for a long time, like I can get to know those ideas. And I know that like when I had first bought the book over winter break, my mom was like, "Oh, Ulysses! Like I remember people carrying it around campus, and like it was such a big deal." And I mean, she went to university in the 80s, so I guess like not that long ago compared to like when Ulysses was published. But I think like there's always been this element of like Ulysses is a project, and like there's been generations of readers who are willing to like commit to a challenge, and that challenge like means something different for each person. But that's what I mean. It's like it's a big book, and it's a book that you can recognize as Joyce, like even when you see it across the quad, for example, in her anecdote. So that's what it is for me. I'd probably have a different answer once I've finished it, but I think like big books are good for the culture. Like people should spend long periods of time reading, or they should read in a reading group like we are.
That's fantastic. I think there's definitely like an element of patience too, to like what you said. Like
Mhm.
I don't know, especially I'm really glad that you suggested that we like have the book club like as a part of our cohort, because
Mhm.
I don't know, there's something about that like grad study sense of like you have so much to read, like you've just got to get through it. It's been very
Mhm.
like exciting to have this like one book where we're all like, no, we're going to like commit the time that it takes to read it.
Mhm.
I feel like it's kind of in the air, you know, like you said, when it's like a book that you can recognize from across campus or like see on the shelf, like even if you can't read the title, there's something about it that makes you want to read it. But like, is there any particular reason why you kind of like came back to it now after that sort of like tepid experience with it in undergrad?
I think this approach to reading maybe longer works of fiction or reading like with a group is something that I've discovered since the pandemic happened.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I don't know. I just feel like I'm more equipped to like sit down with a group of people like over Zoom and talk about a book, for example, over a period of weeks, which is something that I don't really think people did as much even 2 years ago. So I
Mm-hmm.
don't even know if like I had a specific reason for wanting to read like Ulysses as opposed to another book, but just that like now that we have these conversational tools and we're like surrounded by people that are interested in literature or like interested in Joyce like yourself, um, we don't have to be like alone in that process, and that way we can like read a lot. Um, and then I guess the second part of that answer would just be like my research is also in the 20th century mostly, so feel like I'm paying my dues a little bit. Like I want to understand or like get to know this period of literary history as well. So yeah.
Well, have you had any, I know we very like briefly touched on sort of like how Joyce represents children, which I know like ties in a little
Mhm.
bit to your work, but has there been like, not obviously not like changing your topic or anything, but has there been
Mhm.
any like line in Ulysses that you've come across and been like, oh, like I wouldn't cite that in my thesis, but it's like, you know, maybe like twigged a little bit that it could relate? I just don't know like how much he, you know what I mean, is like useful or connected to like other areas in the 20th century.
Like I know we see Bloom's daughter, but she's kind of more remote in like where I'm at in the book right now. But I think there is something to be said about like the period of one day, like a book taking place over one day or a book recording
Mm-hmm.
someone's like stream of consciousness or like mental process that I think is maybe more how we experienced the world as a child.
Oh.
So I guess like, I don't know, in grad school or in our professions or whatever, like we're really trained to think like years in advance, and like spending like whatever 700 pages on one day and like really soaking in like every corner of that day or whatever is um maybe more how we experience the world as young people, where I don't know, you feel like you woke up in the day like really stretched forward a lot longer than it does now when we're so busy or when like our days are so stacked with activities.
Okay, wow. I had never thought of that before. I feel like that's really interesting in context of like, so the short stories of Dubliners are kind of like split into, it's not like in the text anywhere, but Joyce wrote about it. Like they're sort of sectioned off into like the first section is about childhood, then adolescence, and then the next couple stories are about like adulthood, and then the last couple stories about
Mhm.
public life. And I think there's something really, I don't know, like driven by age about Joyce's work, where I just find it so fascinating that like within 3 years of his life or whatever, he could write from the perspective of a 7-year-old, but then also from the
Mhm.
perspective of like these like middle-aged like Gabriel and Greta at the end. But yeah, I had never put it together like that for Ulysses, but I think those definitely must be in conversation.
I'm sure, yeah. I remember there being like more of a sense of like family life and like the moving parts in a family in even the dead as well. So I guess that's
Mhm.
another reason to read th- those stories again as well.
For you, how closely tied to the text does the book club feel? Like, does it feel like there's this like more social element that's like part of your Joyce experience?
For sure. Like I don't think that I've had the kind of the patience that we've talked about to finish this book on my own, like
Mm.
without a community of people reading it. So I think
Mhm.
um that's been helpful. Like yeah, I guess I do rely on other people in terms of like understanding Ulysses. I like look forward to what other people say to understand what Joyce is saying. So there's something about like having faith in others that like enriches our reading of the book in the book club, I think.
Okay, I love that, having faith in others. And I think it's like even if you are like reading it alone, like I remember I read Ulysses for the first time alone, but also I
Mhm.
had a lot of different like commentaries and annotations with me and that sort of thing. And I
Right.
think, yeah, I don't know. I think that like thinking of these like conversations that we have in the book club is sort of like the same as annotations almost, but just like sort of with stripped of
Mhm.
the authorities so that you can take them a bit more like as you will.
100%. I remember one day you showed us like the little sketch that Joyce had done of Bloom. And it's like a really primitive, like it's like a child sketch where he has like funny eyes or funny face or whatever. Um, and I think that that's actually such a powerful image because it is so kind of crude and like it's not like I don't know, it's so simple and there's such a humor to it that I think it kind of it humanized Joyce a little bit where I was like,
Okay.
okay, he wrote Ulysses, but he also drew this. And like I can connect with him on the level of this drawing a little bit. So I think that is like maybe my one thing outside of the text that drew me back in, even though it's like such a little thing.
Okay. That's
They should put that on
fantastic.
the cover of Ulysses, honestly. On the Oxford edition or the Norton edition, whatever.
I would love that. That's our like goal. I feel that'll be like our first. The next time somebody's like, "Oh, we need like a scholarly edition of Ulysses,"
Yeah,
and we like have doctorates or whatever, we're like, we can tell you what the cover should be at any rate.
exactly.
I think there is something interesting about the phrase like humanizing Joyce too, because I don't
Mhm.
know, like so many people seem to first see him like through these preconceptions that we have of like I don't know, like Ulysses as very like highfalutin and like almost purposely like not understandable.
Mhm.
I don't know. Do you know anything like I feel like the drawing is like really such a great sort of like callback to like, hey, he did other stuff. He was not just like
Right.
sitting at a desk writing Ulysses his entire life. But is there any other sense that you have of like who Joyce is like either like as a concept now or as a person that's like helped you or hindered you with your reading?
I would say, I guess the only other like choice I've read are his letters to his
Okay.
love letters to his wife, which we've talked about how they're kind of like silly and we laugh at them now. But there is, I think that's another like piece of Joyce that really humanizes him because it is like so bodily. And I know that there's a lot of the body in Ulysses as well, but it's his body
Mm-hmm.
in the letters or his wife's body. Um, so I think that that's also helped me understand Joyce, I guess, as a person as well. I think something that's complicated Ulysses and complicated Joyce for me are the conversations we've had about his relationship to Catholicism, for example, or religion,
Okay.
because maybe that is such like a fraught relationship, and because it's like fraught in the book as well. Um I'm like curious to know more about his connection to the church and to God and these things, because it does seem kind of ambiguous.
Yeah, for sure. Do you I feel like it's a pretty typical thing to sort of read Stephen as this like almost like one-to-one, like, oh, he is Joyce.
Mhm.
So have you found yourself looking towards Stephen and like his like some of the things that he's already said about religion, and we'll get more from him. But have you taken those at all as sort of like this at least introduction into Joyce's own religion?
Maybe like it's always, I think, great to have a character that's unsure in a
Mm-hmm.
novel. I think that's like the sign of good writing or like good characterization. Um, I had never thought about Stephen like as a stand-in for Joyce before that clearly, although maybe we had talked about it.
Mm-hmm.
But I know that earlier on, I mean, when we were talking about, for example, Stephen's relationship to his mother's death and her funeral and praying for her, we had talked about The Stranger by Camus, and how he similar has a like kind of similar reaction to his mother's death, and how I don't know, that there's this similarity between the stories. But what I find like richer, or what resonates with me more in the Joyce, is that that concern is more rooted in like a crisis of faith rather than like the kind of nihilism or existentialism in Camus. So yeah, that's interesting. I'd have to think about it more.
Okay.
But I do like period like the idea of having like a character who's questioning or like struggling.
Yeah, for sure. And I think I'll say like personal experience with Ulysses anyway is because I read Portrait first, and it's so much
Mhm.
about Stephen, and sort of like it shows like the moments when he first sort of like questions Catholicism and then comes
Mhm.
back to it, and then sort of like officially is like, no, that's not for me, sort of thing. But I very much read Ulysses the first time being like, this is okay, like it'll give me the answers to like
Right.
Stephen's like sort of like religious maturity.
Mhm.
Spoiler alert, it does not. But I think, yeah, I don't know. The way that you said it has like reassured me a bit in my own reading, because I think I was very much looking for, those answers, and was a bit worried
Mhm.
of like, oh, like how much am I like Stephen? How much are all of us like Stephen in this way of like not knowing what's going on? But
Mhm.
yeah, it's easier to be like Stephen when you see him as sort of like the crux of like why it's a good novel. Makes it
Right.
a bit
Yeah.
easier.
Something we've talked about a lot in our program is like being able to think critically and write honestly and like fairly about writers we have like a personal connection with, or that we're really passionate about. Um, so I was wondering if you could speak to like maybe your emotional ties to Joyce or to Ulysses in general, and like how you see that relationship has changed or like changing, or yeah.
Yeah. Ooh, I would definitely say it's in like a state of changing right now, because
Mhm.
the first time that I like tried to read Ulysses in high school, and like I was going to a Catholic high school, so that whole like it was an interesting way to read it. And
Right.
I was kind of that like I think a lot of us were. I was that like presumptuous 15-year-old who was like, I can read anything, I just want to be. And so I had to give up. I
Mhm.
don't, maybe like 5 chapters in, and I was like so mad. Like I hated Joyce.
Yeah.
My pride was hurt. I thought that he sucked. And it wasn't until I came back to it sort of in my like second and third year of university that, or
Mhm.
like undergrad, that I was like, okay, like never mind. So I think that that has definitely like, I think of that sort of like shift that I had, and especially being so dramatic, as very much like helpful in my research, where as much as I have these strong emotions towards Joyce, it's not like hero worship, and it's not just like, oh, like I see myself so much in this author and I think that everything that he did was great. So I think it was
Mhm.
like really handy for me to like sort of have this like full range of hating Joyce all the way to thinking he's fantastic. But yeah, I think it's in sort of like a flux right now, especially I think because of like being in a master's program. And we were talking about how it feels like your brain is being rewired. And like sometimes I think that that's like we've talked about that sort of as like a painful experience where you're like, I don't know how to deal with the way that my brain's working now.
Right.
But also I think it has been very helpful for me, I think, to have Joyce as sort of this, not like a grounding, but like it's like a linchpin almost, where it's like everything, like because I came into the program so firmly with him like at the center of my research, and I still think he is, but he's sort of like the center is becoming smaller and like an ever growing like idea of what I want to work on. Yeah, I think it's sort of now I'm like trying to find that balance of like how do you like care for something dearly while at the same time sort of seeing it as like a smaller and smaller piece of your work. But I'm hoping that those will like come to a balance where it's like good, and it sort of prevents me from just like, you know, spending my research paper like just gushing about how great he is. But
yeah,
I don't
well,
know
I think something that I really admire about you and your research and like this project in general is that you're so like generous with your conversation and like your opinions and your theories about Joyce, because we've had this conversation about in our seminars about modernism as well, about how it's kind of like maybe an ivory tower, like it's a closed kind of community where people are like people's sense of individuality or their sense of their like intelligence or their work is so bound up with how like impenetrable modernist literature can be. But I think by like engaging in these kind of like public scholarship projects or like reading Ulysses in a group rather than like in our bedroom cuddled up, like there's important like democratizing work to be done there as well. And maybe that like enriches our understanding of these books rather than needing like to match Joyce's genius with our own individual genius or something. So I really like commend you for that.
Oh, thank you. I feel like I totally agree with it, not in like the commending myself agree with you.
No.
But no, like I really agree with you that I think like modernism and these like preconceptions that people have about Joyce, I don't know, like I think Joyce especially is sort of the like white dude of modernism, so he gets to be sort of like the very top of the mountain of it. And also I think, I don't know, I feel like this even ties back to your question about like your personal relationship to the author. I think our personal relationship with Joyce and how I kind of hate him and think that he was like disgustingly sexist, but also like he helps me so clearly see my Catholicism, and I like love him for that. I feel like when it would be a danger to leave those sorts of emotions at the door of research, because I think when you leave those sorts of personal relationships out of your work is when literature becomes this like, I just enjoy reading Joyce because I'm so smart and I can recognize his like his all of his illusions, rather than I enjoy Joyce because I'm very like personally bound up in this text. Yeah, I feel like it'll be a interesting balance that all of us go through like with our final projects next year, sort of seeing, because I think we've all chosen things that we care about very dearly, and it'll be weird to like find that balance of also, and I think it's one of these things where we want to match like sort of like the academic expectations of, you know, you can't be like, you know, you don't want to, of like how much personal experience you should bring in, but I think also understanding like where our limits are, and you know, like how much of ourselves we're comfortable with having some like sort of impersonal grad committee read.
Right. Yeah, I think like the 20th century is also unique in that way, because it's not like the early modern period or Shakespeare or something where I feel like people have personal connections to the work, or maybe I can't speak for them, but it does feel like more remote. Where and in contemporary writing, like you can read an author's Twitter feed and be like, okay, this is a real person, and today I disagree with what they said, or their next novel is terrible, but I like the last one. But like people in the 20th century are situated at such a point where they're kind of far off, but they're like maybe our great grandparents' age or our grandparents' age. So we still
Yeah.
feel like some sort of personal tug towards them. So it's an interesting period emotionally to be working with that way as well, because we still know people that maybe lived in that period or knew people that lived in that period. But then those books have already gained like prestige or like classic status. So it's harder to like critique them the way that we would critique, for example, like a Sally Rooney novel that just came out like a couple of weeks ago. So I think there's that as well, which is interesting about the 20th century.
Yeah. And I think like you talked about reading his letters as well. I think that there is something about that like drew me to 20th century studies. I don't know if it's the same for you, but this way of like that nice balance of like I don't have to deal with like what if my author like pulls a JK Rowling and then like
Right,
you know
exactly.
what I mean? But also like I still have like a lot of information about my author and you can kind of like put them together as a human, as a person who makes like tiny crappy doodles of their characters. I don't know. It's an interesting balance to be working with these like
It is.
just like 100 years old, not quite ancient, but like far enough away that we don't recognize that world.
Right. Like I could still like wear pants and talk to James Joyce. You know what I mean? Like there's that much proximity to him. I don't have like Jane Austen or whatever.
Yeah, that's so true. I think that's a good. The next time somebody asks us about like the period that we study, we can just be like, I could like wear what I'm wearing right now, and my author would not be
Yeah.
weirded out. Like that. I think that that's a good measure, honestly. I hadn't thought of that. Is there anything, however small, memorable about this conversation?
I guess like I'm just like constantly becoming aware again and again that like you can have non-academic like personal conversations with people about literature and like learn about books that way. I think that's again part of like the conversation we were having about our brains being rewired by grad school or whatever, but that like you can talk about great works of literature as friends with your friends and it's just as like enriching. So I don't know if that's specific to Joyce, but I think something important to remind ourselves when we are faced with like those big books.